أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. This is to continue my talk about the motor system and the motor function of the nervous system, and how can the brain control the voluntary and the involuntary components of the motor system, or the motor function of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, of course, because both are involved in execution of voluntary movements and the involuntary actions also, or the involuntary movements. The voluntary moves, of course, as we all know, this is the function of the skeletal muscles of the body, and the involuntary is the function of the smooth muscles which control, for example, the vital organs, which control the movement of the cardiac muscle, and also the muscles of breathing and the gastrointestinal tract, which are under control of what we call the autonomic nervous system. And this autonomic nervous system is controlled centrally and mediated centrally through a nervous tissue and circuits in the medulla oblongata, which is the lowest part of the brain stem. So let me start with the voluntary control. And the voluntary control, or the part of the motor system which controls the voluntary muscle action, are the cortico-spinal tracts, or what we call the pyramidal tracts, and the extrapyramidal system, including the extrapyramidal nuclei and the extrapyramidal tracts. Let us start with the pyramidal tracts, and the pyramidal tracts involve or include, or is formed of two tracts: the anterior corticospinal and the lateral corticospinal tracts, which arise from the motor cortex. That's the motor part of the cerebral cortex, namely in the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere, then where the nerve cells mediating the motor functions are there, in the motor area, in the prefrontal gyrus of the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemispheres. And then the fibers arise from this area, the prefrontal area, or the motor cortex, and then go down to the spinal cord, the anterior horn cells in the spinal cord, and this is what we call that's why we call it the corticospinal tracts. And then from the spinal cord arise nerve roots and nerve fibers, which will form the peripheral nerves supplying the upper limbs and the lower limbs, that is the arms and legs, and they control the skeletal muscle movements of the arms and legs, that is the extremities of the human body, and also the muscles of the trunk, and the muscles of the back. So these are the what we call the corticospinal tracts. And we all know that the motor function of the pyramidal tracts is to execute its function and allow the skeletal muscles to perform its action smoothly and easily. And then we have the cortico-bulbar tracts, which is the extrapyramidal tracts. The cortico-bulbar also, which is part of the pyramidal tracts, and the cortico-bulbar, they arise from the cortex, same also, they arise from the motor area of the cerebral cortex, but they go down to the bulbar nuclei, which are the nuclei of the cranial nerves, which we all know that we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and these cranial nerves will supply the voluntary muscle action of the head and neck region. So the voluntary muscles of the region of the head and neck, they are under control of the cortico-bulbar tract. So again, the voluntary action of the head and neck muscles, they are under control of the cortico-bulbar tracts. The cortico-bulbar, which arises from the, again, as its name indicates, arises from the cerebral cortex and go to the bulbar area of the brainstem, namely in the pons and in the medulla, and also the midbrain. So, and then this area contains the nuclei of the cranial nerves. And then the cranial nerves, which are responsible for supply of skeletal muscles of the head and neck, will be under control of this corticobulbar. So the corticobulbar from the cortex to the bulbar area of the brainstem, and then from the bulbar area of the brainstem, where the cranial nerve nuclei are there, including the trigeminal nerve, the fifth cranial nerve, the facial nerve, the seventh cranial nerve, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, number 9, the glossopharyngeal, of course, the vagus, which is the longest extracranial cranial nerve with extracranial course, which supplies the viscera with the autonomic supply, the vagus nerve, the very important, most important, number 10th cranial nerve, and the glossopharyngeal, which is number 9, as I mentioned, and the cranial accessory nerves. And you have the spinal accessory, which supplies, of course, the trapezius muscle. So this is the cranial nerves continue the anatomic supply, which mediates the function of control of the voluntary action of the head and neck muscles. This is the pyramidal tracts. So the pyramidal, again, to sum up, consists of the corticospinal, which supply the skeletal muscles of the limbs and the trunk, and the corticobulbar, which control the voluntary action of the muscles in the head and neck region. Of course, like as I mentioned, the facial muscles, which we call them the muscles of facial expression, and the muscles of mastication, and the neck muscles, the sternocleidomastoid, and the other neck muscles, which also are under control of these cranial nerves. So this is what we call the pyramidal tract. And then we have the other component of the motor system, which is important for, as we all know, the control of the smooth and fine action of the pyramidal. So the pyramidal cannot do its action without the help of the extrapyramidal to be executed in an easy, smooth, coordinated way to keep the posture, and also which help in what we call reflexive movements. So this extrapyramidal tract, in fact, they are responsible for postural stability and reflexive movements. And the extrapyramidal system includes nuclei, or what we call the basal ganglia, and also other extrapyramidal nuclei, and the extrapyramidal tracts. Let me start with the extrapyramidal nuclei. The extrapyramidal nuclei include the most common, of course, the basal ganglia, which I explained them in another lecture yesterday when I was talking about the introduction to movement disorders and involuntary movements, when I was talking about the Parkinson's disease and Parkinsonian syndrome. And this include the basal ganglia, and the basal ganglia includes the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus, which is formed of an outer part called the putamen and an inner part called the globus pallidus. And the globus pallidus is divided into an external part, we call it the globus pallidus externus, and an internal part, we call it globus pallidus internus. So these are the divisions of what we call the corpus striatum. And the corpus striatum is the main part, or the main bulk, or the main tissue of the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei, which, as I mentioned before, they are subcortical neuronal tissue inside the white matter of the cerebral hemispheres. But these nuclei are gray matter, of course, in nature, because they are formed of nerve cells. And the nerve fibers which arise from them forming tracts, these tracts, because as we all know that any tract in the central nervous system is formed of nerve fibers. and it is white matter in nature. These nerve fibers which arise from the nerve cells of the extrapyramidal nuclei, including the basal ganglia, will form what we call the extrapyramidal tracts. I will mention them after finishing talking about the extrapyramidal nuclei. So the extrapyramidal nuclei include the, as I mentioned, the main part is the corpus striatum, and the corpus striatum is formed of a caudate nucleus and the lentiform, and the lentiform is divided into putamen, which is its outer part, and the globus pallidus, which has also outer part, we call it the globus pallidus externus, and an inner part or internal part, we call it the globus pallidus internus. So this is the corpus striatum, which is formed again of, to repeat, the caudate, putamen, and the globus pallidus. And then we have two other nuclei. We have two other nuclei, which are the substantia, also belong to the basal ganglia, which are the subthalamic nucleus in the subthalamus, which is part of the diencephalon. We all know that the diencephalon is part of the forebrain, or what we call the prosencephalon embryologically. And this diencephalon is very important because it consists of the thalamus, which is the biggest part of the diencephalon, and then the hypothalamus, which is very important in the homeostasis and in endocrine functions. And it carries on. I already talked before about the hypothalamus before. It's a very important nervous structure, and this is part of the diencephalon. And then we have the epithalamus, and then we have the subthalamus. The subthalamic nucleus is part of the basal ganglia, or what we call the subthalamus, or the subthalamic nucleus, or the STN, subthalamic nucleus, STN. And then the fourth part of the basal ganglia is the substantia nigra. And the substantia nigra is, in fact, the part of the brain which is related functionally to the pathogenesis and the etiopathogenesis. If a lesion happens in this area, the substantia nigra is responsible for the Parkinsonian syndrome. Although the Parkinsonian syndrome is also related to other lesion locations in other parts of the extrapyramidal nuclei or the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei. So these are the four parts of the basal ganglia or the basal nuclei. And then we have also other two important nuclei in the brainstem, which are, in addition to the caudate and to the lentiform nucleus and substantia nigra and the subthalamic nucleus, we have also other extrapyramidal nuclei in the medulla oblongata, which are the red nucleus, what we call the red nucleus, and the reticular formation. The reticular formation of the brainstem, namely the reticular formation inside the medulla oblongata. And we all know that in the reticular formation of the medulla, we have the autonomic nuclei, which are responsible for control of the blood vessels, the vasomotor center and the cardioinhibitory center, the center is responsible for control of cardiac action and the cardiac contractility. That's why we call it the vital centers in the they are embedded in the reticular formation of the medulla oblongata. That's why the medulla oblongata, which is the lowest part of the brainstem, is responsible for carrying the most important functions to keep the life of the human body, which is the autonomic centers controlling cardiac action, vascular tone, and breathing. In addition to, of course, the vomiting center and hiccup center and other centers present in this area of the brainstem, namely the medulla oblongata. So this is the components of the what we call the extrapyramidal nuclei, including the basal nuclei or the basal ganglia, and the in addition to the red nucleus and the reticular formation. And then from these nuclei or these extrapyramidal centers, we get the extrapyramidal tracts, which are the one arising from the lateral vestibular nucleus. We call it the vestibulo spinal tract starting from the lateral vestibular nucleus in the brainstem, in the medulla, and then goes down to the spinal cord, to the anterior horn cells also. So we call it the vestibulospinal tract. And we have the rubrospinal tract. Arising from rubro means it arises from which part? The red nucleus. Yes. So the rubrospinal arises from the red nucleus and goes down to the spinal cord, namely to the anterior horn cells, also to control the actions executed by the extrapyramidal system, the rubrospinal. And we have the vestibulospinal, as I mentioned, and we have the tectospinal, number 3, extrapyramidal. So we have and also another tract from the inferior olivary nucleus goes down also to the spinal tract, and from the reticular formation to the spinal cord, and from the reticular formation to the spinal cord, which we call it the reticulospinal tract. So the pyramidal tracts, to sum up, are for the reticulospinal tract from the reticular formation to the spinal cord, the reticulospinal, the rubrospinal from the red nucleus in the medulla down to the spinal cord, the vestibulospinal from the lateral vestibular nucleus to the spinal cord, and the tectospinal from the tectum of the midbrain down to the spinal cord. This is the tectospinal. So the tectospinal, the vestibulospinal, the rubrospinal, and the reticulospinal, they are the extrapyramidal tracts. So this is in short to revise quickly the components of the pyramidal. As I mentioned, the corticospinal and the corticobulbar, and the components of the extrapyramidal system, including both the extrapyramidal nuclei as summed up by the basal ganglia and the other nuclei in the brainstem, which are the red nucleus and the reticular formation, in addition to the substantia nigra and subthalamic nucleus, because they are at the connection between the diencephalon and the brainstem. Because as we all know that the diencephalon lies above the upper part of the brainstem, which is the midbrain. So sometimes we put it with the nuclei belonging to the extrapyramidal system inside the brainstem. The subthalamic nucleus and the substantia nigra, in addition to the red nucleus and to the reticular formation nuclei. So this is the extrapyramidal nuclei. And the extrapyramidal tracts, as I mentioned, the vestibulospinal, the rubrospinal, the reticulospinal tracts, and as I mentioned, the vestibulospinal, the reticulospinal, the rubrospinal, and the tectospinal tracts. This is the extrapyramidal tracts. By this, we finish the anatomy or the neuroanatomy of the motor system of the brain, which controls the voluntary and the involuntary muscle actions of the body. And as I mentioned, the involuntary muscle action, it is controlled centrally by nerve cells situated in the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata, namely what we call the autonomic nervous system nuclei in the medulla oblongata, اللي هما فيهم ال centers controlling the heart والbreathing other involuntary systemic action زي الكنترول of the gastrointestinal tract smooth muscles المسؤولة عن الجاستروintestinal motility والsecretions وكل الكلام ده. So this is the anatomy of the motor system in short. لأن ده ليه علاقة اللي أنا ذكرته because the extrapyramidal part has relation to the what we call the lesion locations, which are connected functionally with the different disorders of movement or movement disorders and involuntary movements, and at the top of which are the Parkinson's disease or Parkinsonian syndrome, including the Parkinson and the secondary Parkinson and the Parkinson plus, and the other hyperkinetic movement disorders, including the chorea and tremors and athetosis and dyskinesia and dystonia and hemiplegismus and these other movement disorders, which I mentioned yesterday. Thank you so much, and my regards to all of you, Professor Dr. Tarek Ali.